In the heart of the city stood a mansion, so large that people often slowed their cars just to stare at it. Tall gates guarded the entrance, marble pillars held up the grand balconies, and expensive cars came and went almost every day. The house belonged to one of the richest families in the country. For most people, it was a place they could only imagine seeing from the outside. But inside that mansion worked a young maid named Aisha. To the family, she was simply part of the staff. Someone who cleaned the rooms, served tea, and quietly moved the hallways without drawing attention. Aisha had started working there almost a year earlier. She came from a small town where life had never been easy. Her father had passed away when she was young, and her mother worked hard just to keep the family afloat. When Aisha got the chance to work in the billionaire's house, it felt like a miracle. The job helped her send money home and support her younger siblings. She kept her head down, worked hard, and tried to stay invisible. In a house filled with luxury, she reminded herself every day that she didn't belong to that world. But there was one thing about Aisha that people quietly noticed. She had a calm presence, kind eyes, and a natural beauty that didn't come from expensive clothes or makeup. Even in her simple Maid uniform, there was something graceful about her. Some of the other staff would whisper about her in the kitchen, saying that she looked like she belonged somewhere far more glamorous than scrubbing floors and polishing silver trays. The billionaire who owned the mansion was rarely home. Most of the time, he was traveling for business, leaving the house under the care of managers and staff. But his son, Daniel, had recently returned after studying abroad. Unlike his father, Daniel wasn't interested in showing off wealth or attending endless business meetings. He preferred quiet moments, reading in the library, walking to the garden, or sitting alone on the balcony late at night. The first time Daniel noticed Aisha, she was in the hallway carrying a tray of teacups. She moved carefully, trying not to spill a single drop. For a brief moment, their eyes met. It was only a second, but something about that moment stayed with him longer than he expected. At first, Daniel tried to ignore the feeling. After all, she was a maid in his house. The difference between their lives was too big to even think about. But the strange thing was that he kept noticing her everywhere. In the garden, watering the flowers. In the dining room, arranging plates. In the library, quietly dusting the shelves. And every time he saw her, that same thought returned. Meanwhile, the staff in the mansion had started noticing something unusual too. The billionaire's son, who rarely spoke to anyone, had begun asking small questions. Who prepared the tea today? Who cleaned the library this morning? The answers were always the same. It was Aisha. At first, the staff laughed it off. But slowly, whispers began spreading through the house. Something unexpected was happening inside the billionaire's mansion. And when the family finally realized what Daniel was feeling, the entire household would be left completely shocked. At first, the whispers stayed inside the kitchen. The cooks and cleaners would exchange quiet glances whenever Daniel walked past. It wasn't unusual for the billionaire's son to be polite to the staff, but something about the way he asked about Aisha felt different. He didn't ask in a careless way. His voice carried real curiosity, as if he genuinely wanted to know more about her. One afternoon, while the sun poured through the tall windows of the mansion's library, Aisha was carefully dusting the long wooden shelves. The room was silent, except for the soft sound of a cloth brushing against old books. She liked working there, because it was one of the few places where she could be alone. The rest of the house was always busy, filled with footsteps, orders, and the quiet pressure working for such a powerful family. She stood on a small ladder, reaching for the higher shelves. When she heard the door open behind her, her heart skipped for a moment. When she turned around, she saw Daniel standing near the entrance. He didn't say anything at first. He just looked around the room, as if he had come there for a reason, but suddenly forgot what it was. Aisha quickly stepped down from the ladder and lowered her eyes respectfully. "Good afternoon, sir," she said softly. Daniel nodded, but instead of walking away like he usually did, he stepped further into the room. His eyes briefly moved toward the bookshelves she had just cleaned. "You work here often?" he asked. Aisha seemed a little surprised by the question. "Yes, sir. Sometimes a manager asks me to clean the library." Daniel paused for a moment, then gave a small smile. "It looks very neat." For Aisha, the conversation felt strange. In most large houses, the family members barely noticed the staff. Compliments were rare, and conversations were even rarer. She simply nodded politely and continued her work, hoping the moment would pass. But Daniel didn't leave right away. Instead, he walked toward one of the large windows overlooking the garden. Outside, the trees moved gently in the wind, and the fountain sparkled in the sunlight. For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. From the hallway, two housemaids passing by slowed their steps slightly. They noticed Daniel standing inside the library, and Aisha working quietly nearby. One of them raised her eyebrows in surprise, but they quickly continued walking before anyone noticed them staring. Later that evening, the whispers in the staff quarters grew louder. "Did you see them in the library?" one maid asked. "Yes," another replied. The young master stayed there for almost 10 minutes. 10 minutes, someone repeated with disbelief. In a house where the billionaire's son barely spoke to anyone, 10 minutes felt like a very long time. But while the staff shared rumors, Aisha was sitting quietly in her small room behind the kitchen. She tried not to think too much about the conversation. For her, working in the mansion was already a big responsibility. The last thing she wanted was unnecessary attention. Still, something about Daniel's calm voice kept replaying in her mind. At the same time, in the main part of the mansion, Daniel was standing on the balcony outside his bedroom. The city light stretched across the horizon, but his thoughts were somewhere else entirely. He didn't fully understand why Aisha had stayed on his mind since the day he first noticed her. But deep inside, he knew one thing. If anyone in his powerful family discovered what he was beginning to feel, it would create a storm inside the billionaire's mansion that no one was ready for. Over the next few days, the mansion returned to its usual rhythm. The staff moved through their routines. The gardeners worked quietly outside, and the security guards watched the tall gates day and night. But beneath that calm routine, something had subtly changed. More than one pair of eyes had begun paying attention to the small moments between the billionaire's son and the young maid. Daniel tried to act normal, but it was harder than he expected. Every morning, he walked through the same marble hallway on his way to breakfast. Before, he barely noticed the people working around him. Now, without meaning to, his eyes searched for one person. Sometimes he would see Aisha arranging flowers in the dining room. Other times she was carrying fresh towels upstairs or helping in the kitchen. They rarely spoke. Most of the time, it was just a brief nod or a quiet greeting. But even those small moments were enough to make Daniel pause longer than he should. One evening, while Aisha was watering plants in a large garden behind the mansion, she heard footsteps on the gravel path. When she looked up, she saw Daniel walking slowly toward the fountain. The garden was one of the most peaceful places on the property. Tall trees surrounded the area, and the sound of water from the fountain created a calm atmosphere. Usually only the gardeners worked there, especially at that hour. Daniel stopped near the fountain and glanced at the rows of flowers. "You take care of these too?" he asked. Aisha gently placed the watering can down. Sometimes, the gardener asked for help when there's a lot to do. Daniel looked around at the garden with a thoughtful expression. They looked better than they did last month. Aisha smiled slightly, unsure what to say. Compliments still made her uncomfortable. From the upper balcony of the mansion, however, someone else had noticed the conversation. Mrs. Carter, the strict house manager, stood with her arms crossed as she watched the garden below. She had been managing the billionaire's household for years and had seen many situations unfold inside those walls. Her experience told her that small moments often led to bigger problems. Later that night, she called two of the senior staff members into her office. "I don't want unnecessary gossip spreading," she said firmly, "but I've noticed something unusual." The staff exchanged nervous looks. The young master seems interested in one of the maids. No one said Aisha's name, but everyone knew exactly who she meant. Meanwhile, in the quiet staff corridor, Aisha remained unaware of the growing attention around her. She continued her work the same way she always had. Quiet, focused, and careful not to stand out. But inside, she felt a strange mixture of confusion and worry. She knew that people like her and people like Daniel lived in completely different worlds. A mansion like this had clear lines between the family and the staff, and those lines were not meant to be crossed. At the same time, Daniel was starting to face a different kind of pressure. His father's company was preparing for an important business event, and Daniel had been asked to attend a high-profile dinner with investors. The billionaire expected his son to start taking a bigger role in the family empire. But even during meetings and discussions about business, Daniel's mind kept drifting back to the quiet girl working somewhere in the same house. What he didn't realize yet was that the mansion had many eyes, many ears, and many opinions. And if the billionaire himself returned home and discovered the whispers spreading through his household, the situation could turn into something far more serious than anyone imagined. The atmosphere inside the mansion slowly began to change. It wasn't loud or obvious, but the tension could be felt in the small glances people exchanged. The staff moved through their duties as usual, yet conversation stopped whenever someone unfamiliar walked into the room. Everyone seemed to know that something delicate was unfolding, something that could easily turn into a serious problem if the wrong person noticed. Mrs. Carter, the house manager, had started paying closer attention to Aisha's schedule. She didn't accuse her of anything, but she quietly adjusted certain tasks. Aisha was asked to spend more time in the kitchen area and less time in places like the library or the garden where Daniel often walked. At first, Aisha didn't understand why her duties had suddenly changed. She simply followed instructions like she always had. But after a few days, she began to notice that whenever Daniel passed through the hallway, Mrs. Carter seemed to appear nearby as well, watching everything carefully. Daniel noticed it too. One afternoon, he walked into the dining room, expecting to see Aisha arranging the fresh flowers like she often did. Instead, another maid was working there. Daniel paused for a moment. "Where is Aisha?" he asked casually. The maid hesitated before answering. "Mrs. Carter asked her to help in the laundry room today, sir." Daniel nodded slowly, but something about the answer didn't feel right. Later that evening, the mansion prepared for a large business dinner. Important guests were coming, and the house had to look perfect. Expensive lights were turned on across the garden. The dining table was decorated with crystal glasses, and the kitchen was filled with the sounds of cooking and quiet instructions. Aisha spent most of the evening helping in the kitchen, carrying trays and organizing dishes. She tried to focus only on her work, but she could feel the strange tension around her. A few staff members kept glancing in her direction, as if they expected something to happen. Upstairs, Daniel stood in front of a mirror, adjusting his suit for the dinner. His father had returned to the mansion earlier that afternoon after weeks of travel. The moment he arrived, the house had filled with a different kind of energy. The billionaire was known for his sharp eyes and strict expectations. Nothing escaped his attention for long. As Daniel walked down the grand staircase, he saw his father speaking with guests near the entrance hall. The powerful businessman greeted investors with confident smiles, discussing deals and future plans. For a moment, Daniel tried to focus on the event, reminding himself that this was a life he had been born into. But then something unexpected happened. One of the servers carrying a tray of drinks stepped out of the kitchen. It was Aisha. She moved carefully through the room, trying not to draw attention while offering drinks to the guests. For a brief second, Daniel's eyes met hers from across the hall. That single moment did not go unnoticed. Standing near the staircase, the billionaire followed his son's gaze. His sharp expression slowly shifted as his eyes moved across the room and landed on the young maid holding the tray. The conversation around them continued, but the billionaire's attention had clearly changed. He watched quietly as Aisha walked past the guests, unaware that one of the most powerful men in the house had just started observing her very closely. And Daniel suddenly realized something that made his chest tighten. If his father understood why he had been looking at the maid like that, the peaceful balance inside the billionaire's mansion might shatter in a matter of seconds. The moment passed quickly, but Daniel felt the tension in the air almost immediately. His father's eyes had followed his gaze, and that alone was enough to make his heart beat faster. The billionaire was not the kind of man who ignored small details. If something caught his attention, he always found a way to understand it. Across the hall, Aisha continued serving drinks to the guests, completely unaware of the silent observation taking place. She moved carefully between groups of businessmen and their families, trying to remain invisible the way the staff were trained to do. But every few seconds, she felt a strange feeling in her chest, as if someone important was watching her. Near the center of the hall, Daniel's father slowly lifted his glass while still studying the room. His expression remained calm, but people who knew him well could tell when he was thinking deeply. "Daniel," he said quietly, without looking away from the crowd. "Yes, father?" Daniel replied. The billionaire turned slightly toward him. "You seem distracted tonight." Daniel forced a small smile. "Just a long day." His father nodded, but his eyes moved back across the room again, stopping briefly on Aisha as she passed behind one of the guests. The observation lasted only a second, but Daniel noticed it. At that exact moment, something else happened that no one in the main hall expected. One of the senior staff members hurried in through the side door and whispered something urgently into Mrs. Carter's ear. Her serious expression changed instantly. She looked toward the kitchen, then toward Aisha, and finally toward the billionaire. For a moment, Mrs. Carter seemed unsure of what to do, but the whisper had already started a chain reaction behind the scenes. Earlier that afternoon, a black car had stopped outside the staff entrance of the mansion. A well-dressed man stepped out and spoke briefly with a security guard. He showed a small envelope with a name written on it, Aisha's name. The guard had assumed it was something personal and passed the envelope to the staff manager without thinking much about it. But when Mrs. Carter finally opened it during the dinner preparations, the message inside made her freeze. The letter contained only a few short lines. It asked about the maid named Aisha, who worked in the billionaire's mansion, and it was signed by someone connected to a well-known media company. Back in the main hall, Mrs. Carter was still processing what this could mean. Reporters normally chase business stories about the billionaire, not members of the house staff. The question alone felt strange and unsettling. Now, as she watched Daniel standing across the room while Aisha quietly served drinks nearby, the pieces in her mind began forming a troubling possibility. Meanwhile, Daniel was completely unaware of the letter or the visitor earlier that day. His focus was on something much more immediate, because his father had finally made a move. The billionaire slowly set his glass down and called one of the assistants standing near him. "Who is that maid?" he asked calmly, nodding slightly toward Aisha. The assistant hesitated for a moment before answering. "Her name is Aisha, sir. She joined the staff about a year ago." The billionaire remained silent for a few seconds, his eyes still fixed on her. Then he said something that made the assistant tense instantly. "Ask her to come here after the guests leave." Across the room, Aisha placed an empty tray on the table and quietly stepped back toward the kitchen doors. She had no idea that two very different problems were beginning to close in around her. One was a powerful billionaire who had just taken interest in her presence, and the other was a mysterious outsider asking questions about the maid working inside the richest house in the city. The dinner finally began to wind down late in the evening. One by one, the guests thanked the billionaire for the luxurious event and slowly made their way toward the grand entrance. Expensive cars lined the driveway as drivers waited patiently outside the tall gates. Inside the mansion, the staff quietly started clearing the tables and collecting empty glasses. Aisha had just returned a tray to the kitchen when Mrs. Carter approached her. "Aisha," she said in a calm but serious voice, "the master would like to speak with you." For a moment, Aisha thought she had heard wrong. "Me?" she asked softly. Mrs. Carter nodded. "Yes, in his office, after the guests leave." Aisha felt a sudden wave of nervousness. In the entire year she had worked at the mansion, the billionaire had never spoken to her directly. Staff members rarely interacted with him unless something serious had happened. As she slowly walked through a quiet hallway toward the office, her thoughts raced. Had she made a mistake during the dinner? Had someone complained about her work? Inside the office, the billionaire sat behind a large wooden desk. The room was quiet, lit only by a warm lamp and the faint city lights coming through the window. Daniel stood near the bookshelf, clearly tense. When Aisha stepped inside, she lowered her head respectfully. "You asked to see me, sir?" The billionaire studied her for a few silent seconds. His expression was not angry, but it was serious. "Yes," he said calmly. "I have a few questions." Aisha nodded nervously. The billionaire leaned back slightly in his chair. "You joined this house about a year ago. Your work record is good. The staff manager speaks highly of you." Aisha said nothing, unsure where the conversation was going. Then he asked a question that made the air in the room suddenly feel heavier. Do you know why someone from a media company is asking questions about you? Aisha looked up in surprise. Media company? The billionaire placed the envelope on the desk and slowly pushed it forward. This arrived earlier today. Aisha stared at the letter, completely confused. She had never spoken to any reporters before. Her life had always been simple and quiet. I don't understand, she said honestly. Daniel stepped forward slightly, clearly worried now. Father, maybe it's just a mistake. But the billionaire shook his head slowly. Powerful people attract attention. I am used to reporters asking questions about me, but not about a maid in my house. The room fell silent. Then something unexpected happened. Aisha looked down at the envelope again, and suddenly her face changed. A faint memory seemed to surface. Wait, she said quietly. Both men looked at her. My mother once told me something, but I never thought it mattered. She hesitated before continuing. Before my father passed away, he worked as a driver for a large company in the city. One day, he helped a young journalist who had been injured during an accident. He took him to the hospital and refused any reward. The billionaire's expression shifted slightly. Aisha continued, her voice calm but uncertain. My mother said that journalist later became successful and promised that if he ever found our family again, he would tell our story to the world. Daniel looked confused. But why now? Aisha slowly shook her head. I don't know. The billionaire remained silent for a moment, thinking carefully. Finally, he looked toward Daniel. You seem very concerned about this, he said. Daniel didn't try to hide it anymore. Yes, Father, because Aisha is not just another staff member to me. The words hung in the air. For the first time, Daniel had openly admitted his feelings. The billionaire watched his son carefully, studying his expression. Instead of reacting with anger, he slowly stood up and walked toward the window. You know what people will say, he said calmly. A billionaire's son falling in love with a maid. Daniel didn't back down. People always say something. The room fell quiet again. Then the billionaire turned around. To Daniel's surprise, there was a small, thoughtful smile on his face. Your grandfather was once a gardener, he said slowly. Our family did not always live in mansions. Daniel blinked in shock. The billionaire looked at Aisha, then back at his son. Sometimes the world forgets where it started. For a moment, it felt like the tension had finally broken. But just as Aisha thought the situation might calm down, a security guard knocked urgently on the office door. Sir, he said, slightly out of breath, there's someone at the gate asking to see Aisha. Everyone in the room looked at him. Who is it? The billionaire asked. The guard hesitated before answering. A journalist, and he says he has documents proving that Aisha's father once saved his life. Aisha stood frozen, realizing that the quiet life she built inside the billionaire's mansion was about to change forever. And none of them yet understood how much that single act of kindness from years ago was about to reshape all of their lives. For a moment, no one in the office moved. The words from the security guard seemed to hang in the air. A journalist at the gate, asking specifically for Aisha. Daniel looked toward her, noticing how surprised and confused she still looked. It was clear she had not expected any of this. The billionaire walked slowly toward the door. Bring him inside, he told the guard calmly. A few minutes later, the journalist stepped into the office. He looked slightly nervous, holding a worn leather folder in his hands. His eyes immediately found Aisha. You must be Aisha, he said softly. She nodded carefully. The man opened the folder and pulled out a few old photographs and papers. One of the pictures showed a much younger man standing beside a small car on a roadside many years ago. That man, the journalist said, pointing gently at the photo, is your father. Aisha's heart tightened when she saw the familiar face. She hadn't seen that picture in years. The journalist continued speaking. I was the one he helped that night. My car had crashed outside the city. I was injured and alone. Your father stopped, took me to the hospital, and waited there until I was safe. When I tried to give him money, he refused. He only said one thing. The journalist paused for a moment before repeating the words. He said, just help someone else when you can. The room became quiet again. I spent years trying to find him, the journalist explained. But by the time I did, I learned he had already passed away. Recently, I finally located your family. When I heard that his daughter was working here in this billionaire mansion, I knew I had to tell the story. Daniel looked at his father, then back at Aisha. The story suddenly felt bigger than the mansion, bigger than the rumors or whispers from the staff. The billionaire gently closed the folder after looking at the photographs. Your father showed great character, he said respectfully. Aisha lowered her eyes, feeling emotional but proud. The journalist smiled slightly. I wanted the world to hear about him. Sometimes the greatest people are the ones no one notices. The billionaire nodded slowly, understanding the message behind those words. Over the next few weeks, the story quietly spread online and through newspapers. But it wasn't a scandal like many people expected. Instead, it became a story about kindness, humility, and the unexpected connections between people from very different worlds. Inside the mansion, life also began to change. The staff stopped whispering about Aisha. Instead, many of them respected her even more after hearing about her father's courage. Mrs. Carter, who had once been worried about rumors, now watched the situation with a softer perspective. And Daniel no longer tried to hide how he felt. He spent more time talking with Aisha, not as a billionaire son speaking to a maid, but simply as two people learning about each other's lives. One evening, they stood together in the quiet garden beside the fountain, the same place where they had once had one of their first conversations. Your father must have been an amazing man, Daniel said. Aisha smiled gently. He believed that small kindness can change someone's life. Daniel looked at the peaceful garden around them. Looks like he was right. From the balcony above, the billionaire watched them for a moment before quietly stepping back inside. His expression was thoughtful, but not angry. Sometimes life created stories that money and power could never control. And in the end, the most unexpected love story inside the billionaire's mansion had started not with wealth or status, but with a simple act of kindness that happened many years ago on a dark roadside.